The floodwaters rose 6 inches in an hour, turning the valley floor into a rushing brown river that swallowed everything in its path. Inside his cabin, Elias Brennan sat on a dry stone foundation while his neighbors scrambled to save what they could from homes that had become muddy, collapsing traps. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten mountain wisdom move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more unbelievable than this one. The spring of 1839 brought more snowmelt than the Appalachian valleys had seen in a decade. Elias Brennan stood outside his brother's cabin on April 12th, watching brown water lap at the bottom logs of the structure Thomas had built 3 years earlier. The water had been rising since dawn, fed by creeks that had transformed into torrents overnight. Thomas had gone inside an hour ago to move supplies to higher ground, and Elias had stayed outside to monitor the water level. He was about to call out when he heard the crack. The sound was subtle at first, like a tree branch snapping under snow weight. Then came a deeper groan, the protest of wood giving way under pressure it was never designed to bear. Elias ran toward the door, but before he reached it, he heard Thomas shout from inside. The shout cut off abruptly. Elias threw open the door to find chaos. The cabin's floor, built directly on the earth in the traditional manner, had turned to mud under the rising water. The bottom logs of the walls, which sat directly on that muddy ground, had absorbed water like sponges over the past 3 hours. The southeastern corner, where rot had already weakened the wood from previous springs, had given way entirely. Thomas had been standing near that corner when the wall shifted. The movement wasn't dramatic, just a few inches, but it was enough. The roof beam connection failed, sending a section of the heavy sod roof downward. Thomas was pinned beneath a log that weighed close to 200 pounds, pressed face down into the frigid, muddy water that covered the cabin floor. Elias waded in immediately, but the water was deeper than it looked, the mud beneath it treacherous. He reached his brother within seconds, but those seconds were too long. Thomas wasn't breathing. Elias spent the next 20 minutes trying to revive his brother while the cabin continued to deteriorate around them. The mud chinking between logs had washed away almost completely, leaving gaps through which water poured in steady streams. More of the floor had become soupy mud. The structure that Thomas had built in 5 days the previous summer was failing in less than 4 hours of flooding. By the time Elias accepted that Thomas was gone, water was 8 inches deep throughout the cabin, and the northeastern corner was beginning to sag. Elias pulled his brother's body from the collapsing structure and carried him to high ground. He sat there for the rest of the day, watching the cabin his brother had built settle further into the mud. By evening, the floodwaters had receded slightly, but the damage was permanent. The cabin would never be habitable again. That night, Elias buried Thomas on a hillside overlooking the valley. And that night, something changed in Elias Brennan's mind. He became obsessed with a single question: why did mountain cabins have to fail? Elias spent the next 3 weeks visiting every cabin within a day's ride of his brother's ruined home. He wasn't making social calls, he was studying failure. Most mountaineers would have accepted Thomas's death as tragic but inevitable, another name added to the long list of men the wilderness claimed each year. Elias couldn't accept that. He had watched his brother die because a cabin couldn't withstand water that came every single spring. That wasn't fate. That was poor engineering. The first cabin he examined belonged to Owen Haskell, a trapper who had lived in the valley for 8 years. Owen's structure showed the same vulnerabilities Elias had seen in Thomas's cabin. The bottom logs sat directly on the ground, already darkened with moisture absorption. The mud chinking between logs had cracked and fallen out in dozens of places, leaving gaps wide enough to push a finger through. When Elias pressed his hand against the southeastern corner, the entire wall assembly shifted slightly. Owen laughed when he saw Elias testing the structure. "Every cabin moves a bit," he said. "That's just how they're built." Elias visited Silas Kern's cabin next. Silas had built his home just 2 years earlier, and already the bottom logs showed signs of rot where they contacted the perpetually damp earth. The dirt floor had turned to mud during the recent flooding, and Silas had simply waited for it to dry out before moving back inside. His supplies had been ruined, His sleeping furs were still damp. But he considered himself lucky because the walls hadn't collapsed. Elias asked him if he had ever thought about building differently. Silas looked at him as if he had suggested building a cabin upside down. "This is how cabins are built," he said. "This is how they've always been built." Walter Pritchard had lost a cabin to flooding 4 years earlier. He had rebuilt using the exact same methods in almost the same location. When Elias asked why he hadn't changed his approach, Walter shrugged. "A cabin is logs stacked with mud between them," he said. "What else would you do?" Elias didn't have an answer yet, but he was beginning to see the pattern. Every cabin he examined shared the same fundamental weaknesses. Walls sat directly on wet ground, allowing moisture to wick into the wood. Mud chinking washed away during heavy rains. Dirt floors became impassable mud during floods. The structures were built quickly because speed mattered more than durability. A cabin that lasted 5 years before requiring major repairs was considered well built. But Elias had watched his brother die in a cabin that was only 3 years old. The pattern he was seeing wasn't acceptable. It wasn't inevitable. It was simply what everyone did because no one had bothered to question whether there was a better way. Over those 3 weeks of examining failing cabins, Elias became convinced of something that would make him a subject of ridicule for the next 6 months. Mountain cabins didn't have to fail during floods. They failed because they were built wrong. Elias returned to his own small cabin in early May and began watching water. Not the destructive floods that had killed Thomas, but the ordinary movement of water through the landscape. His cabin sat near a creek that swelled each spring, but had never threatened his structure because he had built on high ground. He spent hours each day sitting beside that creek, observing how water behaved around different obstacles. He noticed that field stones in the creek bed stayed dry on top, even when water rushed around their bases. The stones created elevation, and that elevation was everything. Water could swirl around them, flow past them, even partially submerge them during high water, but their tops remained above the waterline. The principle was simple, almost embarrassingly obvious, but no one applied it to cabin construction. Every cabin in the valley sat directly on the ground, as if builders assumed water would politely stay away from structures meant for human habitation. Elias walked along the creek for miles, examining how different materials interacted with water. Wood that touched water constantly showed rot within a year. Wood elevated above water, even by just a few inches, could last decades. Stone didn't rot at all. It simply endured, unmoved by moisture that would destroy organic materials. He found a fallen tree that had landed across the creek years earlier. The portion of the trunk that rested on stones above the waterline remained solid. The portion that rested in the water had rotted to softness. He examined how water moved during storms. It didn't seep gradually upward. It rose from below and penetrated from the sides wherever it found weakness. Traditional cabin construction offered water every advantage. Gaps in mud chinking became pathways for water to enter. Ground-level walls absorbed moisture through direct contact with wet earth. Dirt floors had no defense against rising water, except hope that floods would recede quickly enough to prevent total saturation. Elias began sketching ideas on pieces of bark using charcoal from his fire. His drawings were crude, but they captured a concept forming in his mind. What if cabin walls never touched the ground? What if they sat on stone foundations that lifted them above the spring waterline? The elevation wouldn't need to be dramatic. 6 inches might be enough. 8 inches would be better. High enough that normal spring flooding couldn't reach the wood. But elevation alone wouldn't solve everything. He had seen water penetrate through gaps and chinking, even in cabins built on slight rises. The mud between logs washed away, creating openings for water to pour through. He needed something better than mud. Something that wouldn't dissolve when water hit it. Something waterproof. The answer came to him while examining the white residue on stones near his fire pit. Limestone, when burned, created lime. Lime mixed with water and sand created a compound that dried hard as stone. He had seen it used in town buildings during a trip to the lowlands years ago. It was waterproof, it was permanent. And it looked white as snow. Elias left the mountains in mid-May with two goals: sell his winter's furs and learn everything he could about lime. The journey to the nearest town took 4 days on horseback, following trails that wound through valleys still showing evidence of spring flooding. He passed 3 abandoned cabins during the ride, structures that had been damaged beyond repair and simply left to rot. Each one reinforced his conviction that traditional building methods were fatally flawed. The town of Greenfield sat in a valley where 3 rivers converged, and its buildings reflected the constant threat of water. The older structures, built using frontier methods, showed water damage and rot at their foundations. But newer buildings, constructed by trained carpenters from the east, used different techniques. Elias spent his first 2 days simply walking through town, studying how professional builders approached the problem of water. He found what he was looking for at a warehouse under construction near the river. The building sat on a foundation of stacked stone that elevated the wooden structure a full foot above ground level. Between the wooden beams, workers applied a white compound that dried hard and waterproof. Elias watched them work for hours before approaching the foreman, a man named Chapman, who had learned his trade in Philadelphia. Chapman explained the process, with the patience of someone who enjoyed teaching. The white compound was lime mortar, made by burning limestone in a kiln until it became quicklime, then carefully adding water to create slaked lime. Mixed with sand in the right proportions, it created a waterproof seal that wouldn't wash away like mud. The burning process required specific temperatures and timing. Too hot, and the limestone became useless powder. Too cool, and it wouldn't convert properly. But done correctly, it produced a material superior to anything frontier builders typically used. Elias asked about the stone foundation. Chapman walked him around the building's perimeter, pointing out how each stone had been selected for its flat surfaces. The stones weren't mortared together in this particular building. They were simply stacked with care, each one chosen to fit tightly against its neighbors. The weight of the building held everything in place. The elevation kept wooden components above the high water line that had been marked on a nearby tree from the previous year's flood. Elias spent 3 more days in Greenfield, talking to builders and watching construction. He learned that lime could be purchased from kilns that operated in areas with limestone deposits, but the cost was substantial and transportation was difficult. He learned that creating lime himself would require building a kiln, gathering limestone, and dedicating days to the burning process. He learned that most frontier builders avoided lime because it was expensive and seemed unnecessary for rough mountain cabins. On his 8th day in town, Elias purchased 20 pounds of prepared lime, a detailed explanation of kiln construction written on paper by Chapman, and basic tools for stone work. Then he rode back into the mountains, his saddlebags heavy with materials and his mind full of plans. Elias returned to the mountains in early June and immediately began the most labor-intensive phase of his plan. He needed stones, not just any stones, but flat field stones large enough to support the weight of an entire cabin. The creek near his property had provided the lesson, and now it would provide the materials. He spent 2 full weeks working the creek bed, selecting stones that met his requirements. Each stone had to be at least 18 inches across, preferably 20 or larger. It needed flat surfaces on top and bottom, allowing stones to stack stably without rocking or shifting. It needed to be thick enough to bear weight without cracking, at least 4 inches from top to bottom. And it needed to be a shape that would fit together with other stones in a stable arrangement. Elias rejected 3 stones for every one he kept. Moving the stones from creek to building site was back-breaking work. Each stone weighed between 30 and 60 pounds. His selected building location sat on a rise 50 yards from the creek, high enough to avoid all but the most catastrophic flooding. He built a simple sled from small logs and dragged stones one at a time up the slope. By the end of the first week, he had moved 40 stones. By the end of the second week, he had 83 stones arranged near his building site, sorted by size and shape. While gathering stones, Elias also collected limestone from an outcropping he knew about 2 miles upstream. The limestone deposits in these mountains weren't extensive, but they existed in scattered locations. He filled his pack with chunks of limestone each trip, building a pile near where he would construct his kiln. The limestone ranged from fist-sized pieces to chunks as large as his head. He estimated he would need at least 200 pounds to produce enough lime for his cabin. The kiln construction took another week. Following Chapman's written instructions, Elias built a circular stone structure 3 feet in diameter and 4 feet tall. The kiln had a firebox at the bottom where he could feed fuel, and a chamber above where limestone would be heated. Air holes at the base would draw oxygen to intensify the fire. A removable stone cap at the top would contain heat while allowing gases to escape. The structure wasn't elegant, but it followed the basic principles Chapman had described. Elias cut firewood obsessively during this period, stacking cords of split oak near the kiln. The burning process would require maintaining intense heat for 12 to 16 hours. That meant feeding the fire constantly, never letting the temperature drop. He would get one attempt at this. If he failed, he would have to gather more limestone and start over. By the last week of June, Elias had everything in place. Stones for the foundation, stacked and ready. Limestone for the kiln, piled and waiting. Firewood cut and dried, the building site cleared and leveled. Now came the test. He lit the kiln fire on June 28th at dawn. The kiln fire burned for 14 hours straight. Elias fed oak logs into the firebox every 20 minutes, maintaining temperatures that turned the stone chamber a glowing orange visible through gaps in the structure. The limestone inside underwent a transformation he couldn't see but could smell. A sharp, acrid odor filled the air as the rock released gases and changed its fundamental chemistry. By evening, smoke rose from the kiln top in wavering columns that caught the last sunlight. Elias didn't sleep that night. He kept the fire burning until well past midnight, then finally let it die down gradually. The cooling process took another full day. He forced himself to wait, remembering Chapman's warning that exposing hot quicklime to air too quickly could ruin the entire batch. On the morning of June 30th, he carefully dismantled the top of the kiln and looked inside. The limestone had transformed into white, crumbly chunks that looked nothing like the gray rock he had loaded 2 days earlier. This was quicklime, and it was dangerous. Chapman had warned him repeatedly about adding water too quickly. The chemical reaction between quicklime and water generated intense heat. Add too much water at once, and the mixture could boil violently, spattering caustic material that would burn skin on contact. Elias worked with careful precision. He removed the quicklime chunks from the kiln using a wooden paddle and placed them in a wooden barrel. Then, slowly, he added water, a ladle at a time. The quicklime hissed and steamed with each addition. Heat radiated from the barrel. The chunks began to break down, dissolving into a thick white paste. He added more water, stirring constantly with a stick until the mixture reached the consistency Chapman had described. This was slaked lime, safe to handle and ready to be mixed with sand. The yield from his first kiln burning was smaller than he had hoped. The barrel contained perhaps 30 pounds of slaked lime. He would need at least twice that amount to chink his entire cabin. That meant gathering more limestone and running the kiln again. But he had proven the process worked. He could create waterproof chinking material himself without relying on expensive purchases from town. Elias spent the next week gathering more limestone and preparing for a second kiln burning. He also began hauling logs for his cabin walls, selecting trees with obsessive care. Each log needed to be straight, approximately 12 inches in diameter, and free of major rot or insect damage. He cut, stripped, and shaped each log before dragging it to his building site. By mid-July, he had 22 logs ready and enough slaked lime from his second kiln burning to begin construction. Owen Haskell rode past one afternoon and saw the piles of white paste, the stacked stones, and the carefully prepared logs. He stopped and stared for a long moment. "You building a fortress or a cabin?" he called out. Elias didn't answer. He just kept working. Elias began construction on July 16, 1839, and his first task was something no one in the valley had ever attempted. He was going to build his cabin walls on top of stones instead of dirt. The mockery started immediately. Walter Pritchard rode by on the second day and watched Elias arranging field stones in careful rows along the perimeter he had marked. "You planning to build on top of those rocks?" Walter asked. Elias said yes. Walter laughed until he had to wipe tears from his eyes. "Walls go on the ground, Elias. Ground supports them. Rocks will just shift and dump your whole cabin sideways." Elias ignored him and kept working. He had mapped out a rectangular foundation 16 feet long and 14 feet wide, large enough for a one-room cabin with space for a fireplace. Along this perimeter he placed his largest, flattest field stones, choosing each one for how well it would support the log that would rest on it. The stones didn't form a continuous wall. Instead, they were positioned at intervals, creating support points where the bottom logs would sit. Each support point consisted of 3 or 4 stones stacked carefully, creating stable pillars 8 inches tall. The selection and placement process took 3 full days. Elias would set a stone, then walk around it, checking for wobble or instability. If it rocked even slightly, he would remove it and try a different stone or add a smaller stone as a shim to create a stable surface. He used a wooden level he had made himself, checking repeatedly to ensure all the stone supports were at the same height. If one support was even an inch taller than its neighbors, the logs resting on them would sit at an angle. Silas Kern stopped by on the 4th day and found Elias lying on his stomach, peering at the stone supports from ground level. Silas asked what he was doing. "Checking the line," Elias said. "Making sure they're all level." Silas shook his head. "You're wasting time, Elias. Even if you get your walls up on those stones, first big wind will blow the whole thing over. Cabins need to be anchored to the earth. That's why we build them on the ground." By July 20th, Elias had all his stone supports in place. The foundation looked strange, like the beginning of a stone building that someone had abandoned after laying only the first course. But when Elias walked around it with his level, every support point was within a 1/4 inch of the same height. He had created a platform 8 inches above the dirt, and that platform was level and stable. Now came the moment that would prove or disprove Walter's prediction. Elias lifted his first wall log, a 12-inch diameter oak that weighed close to 150 pounds, and placed it carefully across the stone supports along the southern wall. The stones didn't shift. The log sat stable and level, elevated above the ground exactly as he had planned. The cabin walls rose slowly over the next 3 weeks, and with each course of logs, Elias applied his white lime chinking. The process was methodical and time-consuming, nothing like the quick, mud-chinked construction most mountain men practiced. After setting each log, Elias would pack the gap between it and the log below with his lime and sand mixture. He had mixed the slaked lime with creek sand at a ratio of 1 part lime to 3 parts sand, creating a mortar that was thick enough to stay in place but wet enough to work into every crevice. The white compound stood out dramatically against the weathered gray-brown of the oak logs. By the time Elias had 4 courses of logs in place, his cabin looked like nothing anyone in the valley had seen before. The bright white chinking created horizontal stripes between each log, making the structure visible from a 1/4 mile away. Owen Haskell rode past with 2 other trappers in late July, and all 3 stopped to stare. "Your cabin looks like a wedding cake," Owen shouted. "What's all that white paint for?" "That's not paint," Elias called back. "That's lime chinking. It won't wash out in the rain." Owen rode closer and examined the walls. He reached out and scraped at the white compound with his fingernail. The dried lime mortar was hard as stone. Owen's expression shifted from amusement to puzzlement. "This won't wash out," he admitted. "But why does it need to be white? Makes your cabin look foolish. Like you're trying to build a church in the wilderness. Regular mud works fine and doesn't draw attention." Elias kept working. "Regular mud washes out every spring," he said. "I watched my brother's cabin fall apart because the chinking failed. This won't fail." The lime chinking took significantly longer to apply than traditional mud. Where most builders could chink a cabin in a single day, Elias spent a week carefully packing his lime mortar into every gap. He worked methodically, ensuring each joint was completely filled with no air pockets or thin spots. The compound was caustic when wet, and his hands developed chemical burns from the repeated exposure despite his efforts to work carefully. But once dried, the lime mortar created a seal that was genuinely waterproof. Word spread through the valley about Elias's strange cabin. People rode out of their way to see the structure with the white walls sitting up on rocks. Most thought it was ridiculous. A few were curious enough to ask questions about the lime, but when Elias explained the keyline building process and the careful mixing ratios, their interest faded. "Too much work," Silas told him. "I can build a whole cabin in the time it took you to make that white mud." Elias didn't argue. He just kept stacking logs and packing lime mortar, building his silly white walls higher with each passing day. By August 10th, his walls were 7 logs high, and the white chinking between them had dried to rock-hard permanence. Elias finished his cabin on September 3, 1839. The structure stood complete with its elevated stone foundation, white chinked walls, and a solid roof of overlapping planks covered with bark and sod. He had built a stone fireplace in the northwestern corner, installed a heavy door with proper hinges, and cut one small window with a wooden shutter. The entire construction had taken 11 weeks from start to finish. Owen Haskell had built his cabin in 6 days. But Elias wasn't interested in speed. He was interested in survival. He moved his supplies into the cabin in early September and waited. Autumn in the mountains was typically dry, but Elias knew the real test would come with spring flooding. He spent the winter trapping, maintaining his cabin, and watching how the structure handled normal weather. The lime chinking remained solid through autumn rains. The elevated walls showed no signs of moisture absorption from the ground. When snow piled against the base of the cabin, it never touched the logs themselves. The 8-inch elevation created by the stone foundation meant the logs sat above the snow line. Winter passed uneventfully. Elias's elevated cabin stayed warmer than he expected, possibly because cold air couldn't flow directly under the walls the way it could in ground-level construction. The lime chinking eliminated drafts completely. When he ran his hand along the interior walls, he felt no air movement through the joints. In Owen's cabin, you could feel wind whistling through gaps in the mud, chinking on cold days. Elias's white walls were sealed tight. Spring came early in 1840. Snow began melting in late March, 2 weeks earlier than normal. The creeks swelled quickly, and by early April, water levels were approaching the high water marks from the previous year. Elias watched the rising water carefully. He had built on high ground specifically to avoid the worst flooding, but the entire valley was becoming saturated. Other cabins, built at lower elevations or near creeks, started showing stress. On April 19th, heavy rains hit the mountains and continued for 3 days straight. The creeks transformed into rivers. Low-lying areas became lakes, and cabins throughout the valley began to fail. George Macklin's cabin, built just 2 years earlier using traditional methods, took on water through the dirt floor until the interior was ankle-deep in mud. The mud chinking between his wall logs washed out in streams, creating gaps that let more water pour inside. George evacuated with his family to higher ground, watching from a hillside as his cabin slowly deteriorated. Walter Pritchard's cabin suffered similar damage. The bottom logs, sitting directly on saturated earth, swelled with absorbed moisture. The southwestern corner began to sag as the waterlogged wood lost its structural integrity. Walter spent 2 days trying to shore up the failing corner with rocks and scrap wood, but the damage was already done. His cabin would need major repairs before winter. Elias sat inside his elevated cabin and listened to rain drum on his roof while water swirled around the stone foundations 8 inches below his dry walls. The flooding of April 1840 vindicated everything Elias Brennan had built. While neighbors struggled with waterlogged cabins and washed-out chinking, Elias remained completely dry. Water rose high enough to flow around the base of his stone foundations, but it never reached his elevated wall logs. The white lime chinking stayed sealed and solid. Not a single drop of water penetrated through the walls. His dirt floor inside remained dry because the elevated structure prevented groundwater from wicking upward into his living space. George Macklin came to visit 3 days after the flooding receded. His own cabin was uninhabitable, the interior coated in dried mud, the walls showing gaps where chinking had washed away completely. He walked around Elias's cabin twice, examining the stone foundations and the white chinked walls. Then he asked if Elias would teach him how to build the same way. Elias agreed immediately. He had never intended to keep his method secret. He had simply wanted to survive. Over the next 2 months, Elias helped George construct a new cabin using elevated stone foundations and lime chinking. The work was slow and labor-intensive, but George had seen what flooding could do to traditional construction. He was willing to invest the extra time. When they finished in late June, George had a cabin that looked nearly identical to Elias's, right down to the white walls that made both structures visible from miles away. Silas Kern watched them work and eventually asked questions about the lime-making process. Walter Pritchard, facing major repairs on his damaged cabin, came by to examine how the stone foundations were arranged. Owen Haskell remained skeptical, but admitted the white chinking was impressive. Elias shared everything he had learned, from kiln construction to proper stone selection to the correct ratio of lime and sand for waterproof mortar. He made no attempt to profit from his innovation or claim ownership of the techniques. The phrase, "silly wall logs," had started as mockery, but it gradually became something else. By 1842, 3 more cabins in the valley had been built with elevated stone foundations and lime chinking. By 1845, the technique had spread to neighboring valleys as trappers and settlers shared information about construction methods that actually worked in flood-prone areas. The white walls became a mark of builders who understood that preventing water damage was worth extra effort during construction. Elias Brennan never became famous. His name wasn't recorded in history books or remembered beyond his immediate community. He lived in his elevated cabin for another 12 years before moving west to the Oregon Territory in 1852. But the cabin he built remained standing for decades after he left, its white walls slowly fading to gray, but its structure still solid and dry on its stone foundations. And scattered throughout the Appalachian valleys, other cabins with silly white walls sat elevated above the spring floods, protecting families who never knew the name of the man who had proven that walls belong on stones, not dirt.